Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has given us irrefutable evidence that health is a global public good. Health cannot be a luxury for some. It's a fundamental human right and the foundation of social, economic, and political stability. A global conversation is now underway on strengthening global preparedness for the next pandemic. One of the most important ideas being discussed is the idea of an international treaty on pandemic preparedness and response. The proposal has received the support of many world leaders, as well as several panels and committees that have reviewed the global response to the pandemic. Such a legally binding, high-level treaty would increase accountability and strengthen the implementation of the international health regulations. It could also ensure robust financing for global health. Such an international agreement would provide a shared framework for addressing shared risks and vulnerabilities. And most importantly, it would reflect what future generations need. At the World Health Assembly this week, WHO member states are discussing how to take this idea forward. This is the time for bold ideas, not about tinkering at the edges. In our interdependent world, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Thank you, and I wish you a productive discussion.
Welcome to this session on health as a global public good, why we need a global pandemic treaty, an issue that is being vehemently discussed in the global health community and beyond. I'm Ilona Kickbush. I'm the chair of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and I have a fantastic group of guests here with me that will answer some questions and explain to us what the treaty is all about. I'd like to introduce you to His Excellency Ambassador of the Permanent Mission of Chile to the United Nations in Geneva, Mr. Frank Tressler Zamorano. To Katharina Böhme, who is the chef de cabinet at the World Health Organization, to Olive Shishana, who is the social policy advisor to His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and to Gabriela Bucher, who is the executive director of Oxfam International. So we have a broad range of voices from the diplomatic community, international organizations, and civil society. So without further ado, I'm going to move to the first question and ask His Excellency the Ambassador that he is one of the co-chairs of the Geneva-based group of Friends of the Treaty. I would ask him to highlight for us why the group really thinks a pandemic treaty is of such relevance, and what time frame do you think will be needed to achieve such a treaty? Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Ilona, for your question. I think it's very relevant. One thing that we can be certain in this world of uncertainties is that probably sooner than later we'll face another pandemic or another health, emergency. This related with the degradation of our environment, our further interaction with our environment. So we have to be better prepared for the next pandemic that we surely will face in the future, and probably will be sooner than later. So that's one of the main reasons we need to start working on a new treaty, a treaty that should talk with the current international regulations in the sanitary area. We don't want to replace the current regulations. What we want is to complement, to see what if areas there's a gap that we need to fill with new regulations, and also in order to prevent further death and in the future scenario that we are talking. Now, when is the best opportunity? I think the opportunity is now. We have all the world focused in the current pandemic. My fear and our fear is that if we leave much time a longer time to start negotiating a treaty, probably new emergencies, we will have other issues that we must face. So in a very optimistic scenario, we would like to start now in June after the World Health Assembly. We hope we can do it. We can convince the other countries to do that, to support this in a consensus way. And if not, we're open to see it in two stages, maybe to start, with a report by the end of the year, and to start the negotiations not further than the end of the year. Thank you, Lona. That will be my response.
Thank you, Ambassador. That leads us directly to Katarina, who, of course, is working closely with Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization. And the proposal to negotiate this treaty, as the ambassador has indicated, is within the context of the WHO. So I would ask Katarina to share with us in what way the WHO is in full support of such a treaty, and what actually the process of negotiation would be, and what will be the role of the World Health Assembly, that means the member states.
Thank you, Ilona. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly shown that we must break the cycle of panic and neglect that has characterized past responses to pandemics. For us, that's really important to get the highest political level engaged and committing to an immediate, sustained, and effective action. For us, this will represent a very important piece of the global health security architecture going forward, and will really contribute to a safer world. The benefits of the treaty approach for us include involvement at both the whole of society, but also all of government levels. And the Director General is in full support of this action being established through a treaty legally binding under international law. We see clear benefits over, for example, a political declaration or other softer instruments. How would such an instrument be negotiated? The World Health Assembly, as you say, would have a central role, in fact, the central role in the treaty negotiations, as the treaty would be rooted in WHO, meaning that it would be negotiated and adopted under the WHO Constitution, Article 19 to be precise. And this would be a two-step approach. First, the treaty text would be negotiated by WHO member states, following a process approved by the World Health Assembly. The next step would then be that each member state would consider the treaty at its national level, and that would again promote an all-of-government approach, and a lot of national engagement, of course, as well. Treaty proponents, as the ambassador has said, including the 26 countries whose heads of state signed the OPAD, support the idea of the World Health Assembly adopting a standalone decision, establishing an intergovernmental negotiating body. Other countries believe that more time is needed, and/or that this should be part of the so-called omnibus resolution on strengthening the World Health Organization. But clearly all countries, I believe, share the commitment to act collectively and with urgency as a general principle. And so we very strongly believe and are optimistic that consensus will be possible.
Thank you, Katarina. And for those viewers who are not as familiar with the World Health Organization, the World Health Assembly is taking place very soon at the end of May, and many of the decisions will be taken there. Olive, we've heard that a number of countries have been already supportive of such a treaty and a treaty process. Many African heads of state have also signed the call for a treaty. But what issues would you say are a top priority for the countries of the Global South in negotiating such a treaty? And how would they relate to the discussions now ongoing at the World Trade Organization, where South Africa, of course, has played a major role in, for example, calling for a waiver of intellectual property?
Thanks very much, Ilona, and also the panelists. Well, for us, the top priority for the Global South is to ensure that member states through the United Nations and its specialized bodies reclaim responsibility for global health policy. Currently, global health policy is disproportionately dominated by private interests. The globalization of patent laws at the WTO has resulted in private power and interest prevailing over the public interest. These rights are part of International Bill of Rights. Of course, as we will discuss later, the International Health Regulations is part of the global health governance framework, but a neglected component of this framework. A pandemic treaty would reinforce the binding nature of these instruments in relation to health equity and health rights. The lesson of COVID-19 is that a binding treaty that has a significantly higher political status than, for example, the International Health Regulations that puts people over profit is critical for this and for future pandemics. A treaty such as this should, for example, ensure that international trade rules do not subjugate the rights of people access to life-saving medication, including vaccines during a pandemic. The kind of framework for a pandemic treaty builds on the initiative of South Africa and India at the WTO, implying that we may not need a temporary waiver of the TRIPS agreement. This is because an inclusive binding treaty to ensure equitable access to medicines required to save lives would be a key provision that permanently overrides commodifying life-saving medications that should be treated as a public good. Even before COVID-19, it was evident that the patent-based model incentivizes the industry R&D investments toward maximizing industry profits and shareholder value rather than maximizing health benefits. Consequently, the advancement of research in many critical health areas is almost entirely dependent on public investment. Private companies that produce medicines based on public investment into life-saving medication still benefit disproportionately. Finally, a pandemic treaty should explicitly include provisions to ensure that R&D is geared towards developing new health technologies that are generally treated as public goods neglected under the current patent system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olive. And that leads us quite naturally to Gabriela and the voice of Oxfam. Oxfam has been very vocal in calling for a people's vaccine. It has done very, very strong advocacy around global health equity and global public goods. So, Gabriela, would you share with us what issues are a top priority for civil society, and how could such a treaty address them, the health inequalities, the human rights issues, and other issues that are central to your advocacy?
Thank you, Ilona, and it's a pleasure to be here with all the panelists. We value very much the effort being placed behind the pandemic treaty, and we need to learn the real lessons from real-time failures of international cooperation on COVID-19. For example, as many rich countries continue to enable global vaccine, what is really an apartheid situation as a result of backing pharma monopolies. And that's despite calls from developing countries, and South Africa as an example here, the World Health Organization, and of civil society. Just how many lives have been lost because of this? So a treaty represents a chance to reshape unequal systems in global health. But one of the fears from civil society is that a treaty can be pivoted to protecting the interests of the rich North from diseases perceived to come from the South, and protecting huge corporations and monopolies instead of universal access. So I have 4 points. To achieve the treaty's potential, first, let's start with a human rights approach. We need a treaty that upholds the right to physical and mental health, underlining that quality universal health care and technologies free at the point of use are vital to achieving this. The treaty must secondly speak to reinforcing the global goals, the SDGs. COVID-19 is a crisis for health, but also for inequality and poverty. So we must build mechanisms for income support and recovery of those at the margins. And I especially advocate here for universal social protection. Third, clearly put, we need a permanent suspension of intellectual property rules for pandemics on all health technologies, combined with technology transfer and long-term investment in a truly global and distributed R&D and manufacturing base, with a binding agreement for this. Today's vaccine apartheid isn't an aberration, it's the system actually working. And President Biden's support of an IP waiver must trigger other rich nations and the G20 to unlock global supply for this pandemic and accelerate momentum for future ones too. And fourth, on governance, we urge equity between low, middle, and high-income nations in shaping the global response. Corporations and their lobbies should not be given a seat at the table given those clear conflicts of interest. That's human rights and development approach, suspending IP rules during pandemics, strategic investment in manufacturing, and equity in governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. These are very, very clear issues that you've put forward, but there's an additional complexity that I would ask the ambassador to speak on, because as we have experienced, global health has become a key geopolitical issue over the last year or so. How can a treaty overcome some of the geopolitical divides and challenges? Or are you seeing that also intrude into the calls for such a treaty? Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Ilona, for your question. It's very complex because I think if you see the multilateral scenario nowadays, it's very divided in a political conflict for different reasons. I won't go on that because it's beyond this, what we are talking here. What we have to make sure is realize that if we want to, in a way, create a treaty that is comprehensive, that is inclusive, we need to realize that we need to tackle the future pandemics in a globalized way. Pandemics nowadays doesn't affect one specific country. Because of the globalization, it will affect the whole world, and we need to act together. That's why the need of a global treaty. And in that sense, we have to realize that the virus don't have boundaries. The speed of spread is going to be much faster than previous pandemics. So we need to work together on that. But there's one thing that I'm concerned because of the other panelists have said, that I think we have to be very careful. If we want to have success in a treaty that tackles future pandemics, it has to be transparent and it has to be inclusive. And that means we have to work governments with the private sector also, with universities also. Nowadays, if you see, for example, in the fabrication of vaccine, we need the research of the universities, private and public universities. We need the research of private labs. We need to incentivize those in a fast way. We need the production of vaccine that probably will not be in the northern hemisphere. If you see the production of vaccine is done mainly in southern hemisphere. In India, for example, has 70% of the production of vaccines in the world. And we need to have that distribution that is inclusive and universal, but we need to work together on that. That's more or less what I see we need to realize, and those kind of things. Thank you very much, Ellen. I don't want to go further because I can talk much further. But the time is
I'm sure, and but I think the message is clear that, you know, despite geopolitical divides, we should be working together on these extraordinary global health challenges and come together over global health like we did in the past in polio eradication and smallpox eradication and other such issues. Now, there was already mention, Katarina, of the international health regulations, and there's quite some discussion whether and how such a treaty could possibly strengthen or even weaken the international health regulations. How does WHO see that relationship between a treaty and the international health regulations?
Yeah, we expect that the international health regulations would be a cornerstone of the treaty and would be strengthened clearly by the treaty. This is in fact consistent with the terms of the international health regulations itself, which recognize in Article 57 that states parties may conclude special treaties or arrangements to facilitate and strengthen IHR implementations. We have very concrete examples to show where the IHR scope has limitations and where a treaty could really help. One example is around the principle of sharing of novel pathogens, their genetic sequence information, sharing of countermeasures, and ensuring equitable access to countermeasures. And so those are just two examples where we think that a treaty would complement IHR and where these two instruments would be mutually beneficial.
Thank you, Katarina. I'll move on to Olive and ask you a question that some of the cynics are asking when one discusses this treaty. And they say, why would countries that have not complied with the international health regulations, which of course was one of the key criticisms also in the context of this pandemic and of the IHR review that recently took place. So if they have not complied with the IHR, why would they adhere to a pandemic treaty? What would you answer such people?
Well, I would say to them that the enforcement measures in the international health regulations are relatively weak. And its political profile is also very, very low. Now, a pandemic treaty would be focused on dealing with the dynamics associated with it and would be agreed to by the heads of state. That makes a big difference. The private sector should explicitly include this in the kind of a treaty as duty bearers of rights, including the right to health, inclusive of medicines, with clear countermeasures in place for failing to comply with promoting and fulfilling these rights during a pandemic. To me, that would be very important.
Thanks very much, Olive. And that leads us to, of course, the big question always. We've already heard transparency also from the ambassador, but accountability is a central issue that has come up again and again during this pandemic. So, Gabriela, what accountability mechanisms for countries, but perhaps also for international organizations, would you like to see in such a treaty?
Thank you. So one of the proven ways to ensure accountability is to lock in civil society participation. So the treaty needs to find ways to institutionalize a different system of decision-making that places heavier responsibilities on all countries, but also allows all countries to share in shaping the global response and better hold each other to account. And second, we need radical transparency on governments' commitments to the treaty and what they have delivered and what they have not. And this transparency must be applied to all investments in pandemic-related R&D and procurement. Too often, these critical interactions are steeped in secrecy. So the World Bank has been trying to create a comprehensive database to collate information such as price and volume about vaccines orders placed between governments and pharmaceutical companies. That would help policymakers to address imbalances in supply and prices more easily, but it would also help support civil society to place pressure on their governments on supply and hold them to account. And third, providing more authority to the World Health Organization to be able to conduct investigations to really bolster the unique multilateral role that it holds.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you particularly for that last point. If we look at all the review committees that have submitted their reports, which will be discussed at the World Health Assembly, all of them speak about the strengthening of WHO, the sustainable financing of this organization, and the ability to actually help that countries can implement and do implement the agreements that they have made with one another. We have a short closing round now where I'm posing a question that I'd like all panelists to give a response to. I have formulated it: what 3 issues must be tackled successfully if the pandemic treaty is really to make a difference? If you think it's just 1, okay. If you think it's 2, but maybe you have 3 that you think are absolutely essential if such a treaty is to be successful. And I'm just going to change the order now. Gabriela, would you say first, how do you think, what are the issues that would make a treaty successful?
I think the priority for us is to counter both the monopolistic and nationalistic urges that shape health and economic responses, and instead put universality, openness, collaboration, multilateralism, and saving lives and livelihoods first. So the 3 things. First, we need to lock in a truly multilateral, fair share, long-term and progressive financing system. Ensure every country is prepared and has access, with equity at its heart. Second, the explicit removal of barriers to equity. So let's replace our monopolistic R&D and manufacturing model with distributed capacity, removing IP barriers, with a goal of all countries having a secure, sustainable supply. And third, a step change in our collective attitude and approach. We need to be reshaping our economies to deliver health for all, not as an afterthought after pursuing GDP over or everything else. That has to be the legacy of this pandemic.
Thank you, Gabriela. And of course, the Director General of WHO has established a council on the economics of health for all to try and tackle some of the other issues that you have mentioned. Olive, what do you think is absolutely critical if a treaty is to be tackled successfully?
Well, I would like to emphasize 3 points. First, those private sector health companies, especially big pharma, should be explicitly listed as duty bearers in relation to the rights to health and life, with states ensuring access to health and medicines in the context of a pandemic. I do believe civil society should monitor this. Secondly, whistleblowers on the emergence of an epidemic must have a direct line to a central place globally to alert the world of an impending pandemic. And that place is the World Health Organization. Thirdly, allowing each region to have the capacity to manufacture medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, and be able to distribute them regionally is a must. This should be facilitated through IP sharing, technology, and know-how transfer. Those will be the 3 points that I'd like to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Olive. Ambassador, your 3 points. We're going to give WHO the last word.
First of all, one of the lessons we've learned is that the failure of domestic implementation of the current regulations. So we need a better way to implement domestically the future treaty and the current regulations. For that, for example, we have the successful universal periodic review in human rights and in corruption. So we can implement something like that. Second, I think exchange of information. Be quick, fast, in order to start creating future vaccines. And in third is the distribution and of vaccines to be universal, and inclusive. I think those are the main issues. I have more, but let's leave it with those 3.
Thank you. It's always clear to focus, and people have said, the treaty shouldn't become a Christmas tree. So to have those really very, very focused issues in mind, I think is critical. Katarina, last word to WHO. What 3 issues must be tackled successfully for the treaty to make a difference?
I'm so grateful for the input received here during this panel discussion, because it's the WHO member states with a lot of stakeholders that will determine the purpose, scope, and content of the treaty. I think you've mentioned all the key areas, maybe just capturing it at a higher level. We see sort of the 3 key actions in the area of systems, where we need agile and effective national, but also global systems for preparedness and response. In the area of financing, where the treaty plays an important role to ensure sustained at-scale financing, both again for preparedness as well as rapid response. And lastly, in the area of governance, where it's about a coherent, inclusive, and robust governance approach that also comprises the accountability mechanisms as mentioned. For us, very important, that we need to make sure that all member states, all countries and stakeholders recognize the value of this treaty that would contribute, as I said earlier, to a safer world in terms of fewer outbreaks, a rapid detection of outbreaks, limited impact of outbreaks in terms of health, economic and social impact, and last not least, the fast and fair access to countermeasures based on a need. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katarina. And as you've indicated, I think a number of really critical treaty issues in terms of content and process and support have been raised in this panel discussion. I hope we have an opportunity that many of the negotiators are able to listen to this panel, to see this panel. We will definitely try and do everything we can that they do. Negotiators in Geneva, G20, G7 negotiators, the big conference will be just before the World Health Assembly, and of course that member states who will decide on the next steps in relation to the treaty at the Assembly will be fully aware of all the issues at stake. So thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you to the organizers for giving us the opportunity to discuss such a treaty. And we hope at the next Global Solutions Summit, we come together to be able to discuss how far we have gotten with the treaty negotiations. Thank you and have a good day. Goodbye.